Hi everyone, welcome back. So we're going to talk first about early Earth and the conditions in which life first evolved. If we envision what Earth looked like a long time ago, billions of years ago, soon after it first formed, we're looking at a molten planet, a place where there is a ton of volcanic activity. It is extremely hot, so hot that liquid water can't exist on the planet's surface. And the atmosphere is unbreathable by our standards. It was with very little free oxygen and filled with lots of toxic compounds that were emitted through a lot of this volcanic activity. But the Earth didn't stay that way forever. Slowly, over millions, really billions of years, as the planet aged, it started to cool down. Eventually, it got to the point where the water that was in the atmosphere could rain down in liquid form and exist in lakes and rivers and streams, seas and oceans. And it's under those conditions that life first evolved. Now, these early pioneers of life, the first things that emerged on this planet that were alive, they were very different from us. They were microscopic, first off, and we also have reason to believe that they were mainly dependent on inorganic resources for all of their needs. Because there probably weren't a lot of organic compounds like carbohydrates and lipids and amino acids and nucleotides. Those are things that living things make. And while we do know of some chemical processes that can naturally produce some of these things, it's unlikely that these early organisms were dependent solely on those natural processes. They had to rely on their own unique biochemistry, their own enzymes, their own metabolic activities to build the things they need. And they got those resources, the raw material, to build all those carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. They got that stuff from the inorganic resources that littered the environment in the atmosphere, as things like carbon dioxide and nitrogen gas, as unique minerals and compounds that you find in the water and in the ground and stone and rock and things like that. These organisms were likely harvesting these things and utilizing them in both synthesis pathways, processes that they used to build organic compounds, in this case from these inorganic resources, things that they needed to grow their bodies and to do reproduction. And also in respiration pathways. These are metabolic pathways that these organisms use to take energy that is trapped inside of chemical bonds and convert them into something that is more useful as an energy source. We know of one major group that became incredibly successful under these conditions. These are the photosynthesizers. They were able to take resources that were around them, that were abundant, carbon dioxide, which was incredibly abundant in the atmosphere, and water, which was also now very abundant, and also utilize the sunlight as an energy source in order to convert these resources into something organic, into a sugar, into glucose. And then they were able to use those glucose molecules to build everything else that they needed. So photosynthesis was very successful, and the living things that could do photosynthesis, they proliferated. They grew in abundance, and there were very little downsides to this process. The only real downside to photosynthesis was that it produced a toxic byproduct, oxygen gas. But that was kind of okay, because oxygen in the atmosphere was scarce. It was not something that these organisms were frequently encountering. And so they could take their oxygen waste product and basically just kind of throw it away. They could throw it into the environment and say, this is not my problem anymore. And for a time, that was fine. That worked. It was a challenging existence because the environment was still quite harsh, but it was successful. The organisms that established on this planet survived and reproduced and became effective at surviving and reproducing on these conditions. But that still had an impact on the environment. Over time, the conditions of the environment did shift. These photosynthesizers utilized carbon dioxide and made it less abundant in the environment. And in the process, they released oxygen, making oxygen gas more abundant in the environment. Interestingly, these gases had a really cool effect on the environment, literally a cool effect on the environment. Carbon dioxide, we know today, is a greenhouse gas. It has this unique quality of trapping light down on the surface of Earth and not letting it escape into the beyond the atmosphere and into space. Oxygen is less effective as a greenhouse gas. It allows light to bounce back up and carry with it that heat. And so if you reduce carbon dioxide and increase oxygen, you actually end up changing not just the conditions of the atmosphere, but the heat of the Earth and how effective the Earth is at holding on to its own temperature. So this cooled the Earth even further as these photosynthesizers kept up their activity. And eventually, the planet cooled so much that liquid water wasn't the only kind of water that could exist. Ice could now exist on this planet as well, and we started getting things like polar ice caps. There were implications, however, on the health of these organisms that were doing this. Over many, many, many generations, over millions, really again, billions of years, their biological processes caught up with them. They built up so much oxygen in the atmosphere, and that oxygen was toxic to the organisms that made it. It was now their problem. They couldn't escape it. It became part of their environment, and it was poisoning them. Eventually, oxygen concentrations rose so high that it was enough to kill all of these sensitive life forms, things that were easily killed by the presence of oxygen. We see the onset of something we now call the Great Oxidation Event. It's one of the first mass extinction events that took place on Earth. Now, this wasn't the end of all living things. There were some organisms that survived that mass extinction event. Organisms that could survive in the presence of oxygen, that they were more tolerant of this toxic compound. And the survivors adapted. They didn't just survive, they evolved to become more effective at surviving under those conditions. They devised not just ways to neutralize oxygen and prevent it from harming them, but they also devised ways of making use of what was once a very toxic thing and turning it into a resource. Some organisms still survived that could not tolerate oxygen. These were the anaerobic life, things that could not survive in the presence of oxygen and required these low oxygen habitats. And they survived because those habitats still survived. There were still some places on Earth, though they were few and rare, where oxygen was limited, where there wasn't a lot of oxygen. And so anaerobic life could still eke out an existence in some of these places. But the Earth did change quite a lot, and life began to shift towards being more tolerant of oxygen. And this is where the aerobic life really emerged. After this great oxidation event, oxygen levels did decline some. They dropped a little bit, but after about 1 billion years, they would go back up to levels where, they're at today. Essentially what we're living in right now, the conditions of our atmosphere at this moment being quite abundant in oxygen, this is actually the same kind of condition that eradicated almost all life on Earth 2.5 billion years ago. So it's pretty surprising. Now, today, we survive under these conditions that were once apocalyptic. But life now today is majority aerobic. This is because we are the descendants of those organisms who survived that great purge, that great extinction event. And so the survivors are the ones that could tolerate that oxygen and devise new ways to not just survive, but thrive under its presence. This is, of course, the story of Earth. This is our story. All of this is what happened in our history. All of this is the history of living things that evolved on this planet and eventually became not just us, but all of the living things that still exist here. Now, Great Oxidation Event occurred long before plants ever existed. It was a crisis of microbes. They were the ones that created that mess and had to survive it. It was long before multicellular life ever evolved. It's something that is attributed mainly to the activity of a group that we call cyanobacteria, bacteria capable of photosynthesis. But those organisms, by the way, cyanobacteria, they still exist today. Now, I tell this story because of something really important. It's a concept about ecology. It's the recognition that no organism is an island. All living things, as they live their lives, affect other living things, either directly, like predation or parasitism or social interaction or things like that, or indirectly, where in the case of these microbes, they, by producing certain compounds and releasing them into the environment, they affect other organisms that they may never have been anywhere near. Think butterfly effect. If this organism wasn't out here making all this oxygen, it wouldn't be a problem, a billion years down the line. The Earth is ultimately a semi-closed system. We have all of these resources that exist on Earth, and we're not really getting a lot of stuff from space. All of our resources are here, trapped here by gravity. And so there's a finite amount of resources at our disposal. These resources can change form, in the case of something doing like photosynthesis, for example. Taking carbon dioxide, the carbon in carbon dioxide can be changed in form and integrated into another compound like glucose. So that's an example of perhaps changing form. You could change the location of those resources too. Take them from the environment and put them inside of a cell, for example, or take them inside of a cell and put them in a different cell, in the case of something maybe eating a cell, and so on. And you can change the accessibility of those resources. You can change how easily it is for an organism to use that resource. Some kinds of resources, like for example those inorganic resources I mentioned before, they're not really accessible to organisms like you and me. We can't just go out there and consume a bunch of carbon dioxide and make use of that, but we can take and utilize the carbon inside of a glucose molecule, for example. That is an accessible resource for us. These are ways that the environment can be manipulated and how one organism, even through indirect means, can influence other organisms. They can change these resources and make them more available or less available or differently available. This is where we start getting into the world of ecology. Okay, ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms and the way that they impact each other, both directly and indirectly, in the environment. Okay, so this is the study of how organisms ultimately interact through association, through predation, through herbivory like grazing, through disease and parasitism, but also through partnerships and through competition. And then all of those interesting indirect interactions. And we're going to get into especially those indirect interactions in our next unit.